Yeah, we are live on YouTube and we are recording this. So in case anybody asks for a
Yes.
recording, we can provide that. Okay, good evening, everyone. We'll get started in a couple of minutes. Thank you very much for joining. Please stay on. Thank you. We have over 100 registrations, but Dr. Patnaik, as Dr. Kirkar and I were just saying, we didn't realize it's a holiday for in some parts of the country today. So maybe people are away and coming back to their homes after a weekend.
Long weekend.
Long weekend after many months, a long weekend. So shall we start?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Great. So good evening, everyone. Good evening to everyone in India. Good morning to those of you joining from the US. A very warm welcome to each and every one of you. This is the 5th PIC conversation of the year. Today's event will touch upon a pressing concern, inequality in India against the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic. It is my great pleasure and honor to welcome and introduce our event speaker and chair. Before I go on, can I please request panelists to please keep their audio muted and video off until they are speaking. Thank you. Our distinguished speaker is Dr. Anup Malani, the Lee and Brenna Freeman Professor of Law and Professor at the Pritzker School of Medicine at the University of Chicago. Dr. Malani was the founding faculty director of the Tata Center for Development, which undertakes and evaluates development interventions in India and trains Indian government and NGO officials. His law and economics research focuses on blockchain, judicial behavior, and the welfare impacts of legal reforms. His health economics research focuses on the value of medical innovation and healthcare insurance, the control of infectious diseases, placebo effects, and conflicts of interest in medicine. Dr. Malani's development economics work focuses on healthcare supply and financing in India and the growth of and quality of life in urban slums. His research has been published in leading journals in a number of different fields, including the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the Journal of Political Economy, the Journal of Econometrics, the Harvard Law Review, the University of Chicago Law Review, the Archives of Internal Medicine, and Theoretical Population Biology. We are honored to have you with us today, Professor Malani. Our distinguished chair this evening is Dr. Ila Patnaik, professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, NIPFP, in New Delhi. Dr. Patnaik formerly served as the principal economic advisor to the Government of India. Other former positions include non-resident senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and regular columnist at the Indian Express. She holds a BA in economics from Delhi University, an MA in economics from JNU, and a PhD in economics from the University of Surrey. Dr. Patnaik's research interests include international macroeconomics, finance and emerging economy, business cycles. Her research on these topics has been published in scholarly journals such as the Journal of International Money and Finance, the World Bank Economic Review, International Finance, and in collected volumes. Dr. Patnaik has served on various working groups and task forces of the Ministry of Finance, including the Independent Public Debt Management Agency, the Resolution Corporation, the Financial Redress Agency, and the Financial Data Management Center. Dr. Patnaik, we are delighted that you could join us today. I know that our 100 plus registered attendees are very keen to hear from our guests, but please bear with me for a couple of brief housekeeping announcements. We've disabled audience audio and video to save bandwidth, We invite questions in brief in the Q&A box. Our speakers will try and respond to as many as possible, time permitting. We are recording this event, which is also being broadcast live on the PIC YouTube channel. And now, without any further ado, let me call upon Dr. Patnaik to offer introductory remarks and then invite Dr. Malani to begin his lecture. Over to you, ma'am. About 5 minutes, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Shilpa. I'm delighted to be here at this PIC conversation with Professor Anup Malani. And my thanks to Dr. Kelkar for inviting me to be part of this conversation. The conversation about COVID and inequality is something that is, something that's on the top of everybody's minds. When we look back at the Indian economy, this has been an issue. Inequality has been an issue even prior to COVID. And recent data and evidence suggests that a lot of what was already there has actually been accentuated, those differences have been intensified by the COVID outbreak and the lockdowns. Now, basically, as an economist, I think we've always worried about the structure of the economy being, partly informal and partly formal, and particularly the structure of employment in the country, where there was a very small, formal, high productive manufacturing sector in particular, and a very large share of employment was in what we may call services, where a lot of those services were informal, low productive, so in retail, in transport, in hotels. And because of COVID and because of the lockdowns that came with COVID, the stalling, the stopping of a lot of businesses who were in this informal sector, whether it's, retail trade like fruit sellers, or whether it is transport, as well as a number of other sectors all across the country, have actually not been able to work. A number of them were self-employed. A number of them were employed in small, very, very small, sometimes micro level, very small firms, not even registered firms, but simply small companies trying to get their livelihoods together. Now, what has happened after COVID? What does the data say? We look forward to what Anup is going to tell us from his research. This evidence is coming almost every day. A very interesting report from SBI that was published, in fact, today, which showed how areas, districts in which deaths were higher than normal, COVID deaths were higher than normal, have seen a lot of withdrawal for medical expenses, and how that has pushed many families into trouble. Similarly, other research showing how in the last 1 year, there has been an 85% increase in gold loans, which is really households being in distress and taking those loans and not being able to repay them. And we are now seeing gold companies auctioning off the auctioning off the gold that people had borrowed against. So as evidence emerges, a lot of this evidence points towards increasing inequalities. But of course, I'm not going to go into this. This is over to Anup now. Anup.
Thank you, Ila. And thank you to the Pune International Center for having me. Let me go ahead and share slides and begin my lecture. All right, can everybody see my slides?
Yes.
Thumbs up? Okay, great.
Yes.
All right, so I'm going to talk today about measuring the impact of COVID on not just inequality, but also poverty, because we're going to have different messages depending on, or different conclusions depending on which of these two outcomes we look at. This is joint work with Arpit Gupta, who's at NYU Finance, and Bartek Woda, who's a researcher at the University of Chicago. And we're going to lean a little bit on some research I also did with Sabarish Ramachandran, who's a graduate student at UC San Diego. Okay, so this is a common graph that you probably have seen from the pandemic. This is looking at, on the left-hand side, mean consumption and income in India, and on the right-hand side, median consumption and income in India during the course of the pandemic, before the pandemic and through the first wave of the pandemic, to be more precise. And you start out in 2019, we're going to take this out through the first wave roughly, or the peak of the first wave, so October. And what you see is incomes and consumption are, we're normalizing it based upon what your 2019 values were. So they're pretty stable through 2019. When you start seeing the first set of cases, you see a decline, and both consumption and income means decline. The peak, or the I should call it the apogee of the change, is at the height of the national lockdown. So you're looking at April 2020 was the worst. And since then, there's been a recovery. In wave 2, there's a dip down again, but the data are still coming out on that. So I'm going to focus on wave 1. If you look at median values, you'll see that there's a decline in income that's a little bit bigger than the decline in consumption. That's actually a good signal that people were able to smooth their consumption. But again, there's a massive decline. And once we see this, almost our immediate reaction is to say, oh gosh, poverty must have increased and inequality probably increased. And we're going to be right about poverty, but I want us to wait before drawing a conclusion about inequality. And that's going to be the focus of my lecture. I'm going to look at the distributional effects of COVID on inequality and try to explain why it is that the impacts of COVID on poverty and inequality might differ. Obviously, you know the context, but I'll just repeat it and put it in a slightly economic framework so you understand what's going on. COVID triggered a combination of social distancing and lockdowns. Social distancing is when, voluntary social distancing is when individuals decide to stay away from economic activity to protect themselves from the virus. And lockdowns are the government trying to do the same thing, trying to make people stay away from each other to avoid spread of the pandemic. You can think of the social distancing, the voluntary social distancing, as a suppression of demand, and the lockdowns as a supply shock. Now, I treat them differently because if you look at wave 1 versus wave 2, you'll see that in wave 1, there was an immediate lockdown even before the cases peaked. So it was really a supply shock in wave 1. In wave 2, we'll see in a second, mobility declined about the same time that cases peaked. So it was some combination of a supply and demand shock. But that gives you a little bit of context. Now, throughout this, if you're going to do international comparisons, it's also helpful to think about what the role of the government was. In the context of this economic crisis, the government didn't play a huge role in terms of providing fiscal stimulus. That's a big contrast with, say, the country in which I'm currently residing, which is the United States, where there's a massive fiscal stimulus that helps sustain incomes. So this is a very interesting question to ask, what happened in India where there was no fiscal stimulus? Our primary source of data is going to be the Center for Monitoring Indian Economies Consumer Pyramids Household Survey. And again, the focus is going to be on wave 1. I'll elaborate. And I hope that the big payoff from this analysis is try to understand the dynamics of inequality in India, especially when we think about supply side shocks, such as wave 1 of the pandemic in India. A broader meta question is whether policy should focus on poverty or inequality in India. I'll reveal my bias. I think poverty is more important than inequality, but we'll let you look at the data and decide for yourself. Okay, I'm going to give you a quick preview because I know that sometimes you run out of time. We're going to find and show that while poverty rose in India, income and consumption inequality fell dramatically in India. Income inequality fell more than consumption inequality during wave 1. Now, inconsistent with this, we'll also show you that the Gini coefficient increased, and then we're going to reconcile the disparate results. Why it is that inequality is measured by income and consumption fell, but the Gini coefficient rose, and tell you a little bit about measurement of inequality. Then the last part, I think maybe the most interesting thing, is getting at the question of why. We've been exploring a few things. I'm going to give you data on one explanation, which is that higher income households, higher quartile households, are exposed to more exposed to fluctuations in the economy, perhaps because their incomes have a higher share that are due to capital as opposed to labor income. And that might explain why it is that they were affected more by the COVID shock. Okay, but we'll look at some labor supply and demand issues a bit at the end too. So here's the background. Everybody's familiar with this. On the left-hand side, you have cases and deaths. They peak around September, October for wave 1. And then again, April or so for wave 2. The second wave is much higher, but also much quicker than the first wave. On the right-hand side, you'll see mobility and lockdown measures. The lockdown measures, this is the Oxford measure, is in black dotted line here. These are Google mobility measures. And what's really interesting to see, the shaded area here and here is the lockdown. You see that during lockdown is when mobility falls the most, and then it steadily recovers, except for when wave 2 starts. But the peak comes after when the decline, the apogee in mobility is. This is also going to be when you see the biggest economic impacts. It's not going to be here, which is an interesting issue to think about when you think about the impact of COVID on economic activity. Okay. So let's talk about the data very briefly, so you're familiar with what material we're working with. As I mentioned, we're going to look at CMIE's Consumer Pyramids Household Survey. That's a panel data set. It's very important. It's not very common to get a large panel like this. It's 174,000 households with roughly 1.2 million members in aggregate. Our focus is going to be on the time series for these households from January 2015 to October 2020, encompassing wave 1, although the entire data set goes from Jan 2014 all the way to April 2021. We're continuing to look at what's happening in wave 2 and want to wait to make any judgments, but we're not seeing tremendous dissimilarities. The sampling for the CPHS, in case you're wondering how it's representative, it's based on the 2011 census. They divide the country into 99 geographic areas. They're clusters of districts that are very similar. They separately select areas that are urban and rural within these clusters to sample. Within rural areas, they randomly select villages. In urban areas, they stratify by town size and then pick urban areas. Within each, they pick some subset of individuals or households, I should say. In villages, they pick 16 households through systematic sampling. In towns, they pick census enumeration blocks and then sample 16 households in that. Each household is visited 3 times yearly for a long period of time, which is one of the reasons why this is an exceptional data set to study inequality. Now, if you've been following the CPHS, which is something that we've been relying on, a lot of researchers have been relying on to understand the pandemic, because unlike government data sets, it's constantly coming out. Huge asset, but there have been 2 large criticisms. The one is a recent criticism by Jean Drèze and Anmol Samanchi, claiming that the CPHS undersamples the poor, and their evidence comes, for example, from studies of literacy. They show that the CPHS shows a higher level of literacy and higher growth of literacy relative to, say, government data sets like NFHS 4. You also see the same thing when you look at, for example, assets like TVs or toilets in homes. They're higher in the CPHS than they are in NFHS 5 for the states in which you have them. But a big question you might ask yourself is, well, hold on a second. Is it the CPHS is wrong, or is it that the government surveys are wrong? Again, CPHS, to their merit, spend a lot of time thinking about the quality of the data and describing how it's done. We know sometimes a little bit less about the details of the government surveys. They're not always as transparent, but it's possible that either one of them is wrong. One of the arguments that Drèze and Somanchi make for why CPHS is not representative is they say that the CPHS, when they go to a village, mainly sample those that live on the main street of a village rather than inner streets. If you'd gone to inner streets, they'd say you'd see more impoverished individuals. That seems like a valid criticism. Mahesh Vyas, who's the CEO and FD at CMIE, responds and says, look, CMIE is representative. They sample 16 households per village, but they don't go to 16 consecutive households. They sample every nth household, where n is some number randomly selected between 5 and 15. So you do get to the inner city as long as the main street doesn't have more than 16 times n households, which is often the case. Now, CPHS has vowed, or CMIE has vowed, to investigate this a little bit more, and hopefully in a round or two, we'll have actually more details on how many of these households are Main Street or inner city. But until then, I think this is just an issue we have to keep in mind. It's not going to affect us tremendously because we're going to show you results conditional on percentile of the income distribution. So you're going to be able to say, okay, look, at the lowest, even below the 25th percentile, what's going on? Because that's how I overrepresent the poor. Are they seeing a decline in income compared to the rich, decline in consumption compared to the rich? So you'll be able to kind of sidestep this to some extent. A second issue is non-response during the lockdown. CPHS lockdown shut down all economic activity, including survey activity. CPHS converted to phone surveys, and from our understanding, what they did is they randomly selected households to call. They didn't call all households because they had a smaller workforce, just their managers working on the phone survey, not the regular field survey team. And so they sampled fewer households, and they also, had a lower response rate for the households that they called. You can see that in this table, it gets to be pretty low. We investigated this by looking to see if the households that were called versus not, and those that respond versus not, are similar to those that did respond or were called. And we found a remarkable degree of balance. I can go into more on this later, but we're not as concerned about this. So we are comfortable using CPHS's weights. Their weights that account for non-response try to make sure that the data set is representative geographically for those different clusters, but they assume that non-response is random. And our analysis of the data suggests that's not a bad assumption. Okay, I apologize for the slow discussion of data, but it's very important to know the quality of the information you're working with before you start drawing conclusions. This also should surprise nobody. We're going to just map here two measures of inequality. One is the World Bank threshold of $1.90. The second is the 7 CPC threshold. Look at that over time. And we're going to calculate the fraction of the population that's below the poverty line. And you see that in urban areas, both of these spike during the pandemic, in particular during the lockdown, and then begin to decline after the lockdown ends. In rural areas, you see the effect among the very poor. In the World Bank, you don't see it so much in the CPC threshold. So I don't think there's any contention that poverty did not increase during the pandemic. It certainly did. But I think the thing that's surprising to us, I imagine to a lot of individuals, is that inequality fell. I'm going to show you this in multiple different ways. Let's start with income. Here is a figure that runs from 2019 to the October 2020 to illustrate the first wave. And what you have is we've indexed income to 100. So your mean income in 2019, that's keyed to 100. And then we plot income for 4 quartiles, first to fourth, where fourth is highest. And we plot that over time. We do it separately for rural areas and urban areas, okay? And what you see in rural areas is that the wealthy, the fourth quartile, the top quartile, sees a quicker decline in income and a slower return of income than the highest quartiles. And in fact, the decline is the largest among that at the apogee. In urban areas, you see an earlier decline among the top quartiles, although they all have about a similar decline at the apogee. But then the return is slowest among the top quartiles. If you look at the interquartile range, you can see that it actually rises during this period, suggesting inequality fell. I think this is the first thing where when we saw this, we said, let's just double check this a few times. So we're going to double check it a few times in our presentation. So let's try it a different way. This is, I think, a very helpful way to think about it. Let's look at the degree of income change from 2019 to 2020. Based upon the percentile of income you were in 2019. So these are the poorest people in India, first percentile. Here's the highest, 100th percentile. We're going to show you the change in income in terms of percentiles, and then the actual amounts of income in 2019, which is red, and 2020, which is blue. And what you see is that the change in income is positive for the lowest income, and at about 10% it's about no change in income. And then anything above the 10th percentile is seeing a decline in income in percentage terms, with the maximum being around the highest percentiles. If you want to see the levels, look at these numbers. You see the 2019 incomes are higher than the 2020 incomes. If you look in rural areas, you see the same pattern, except it's in some sense a little bit more progressive. Up to the 30th percentile of income saw actually an increase in income during the pandemic. It's the people that are above the 30th percentile that saw a decline. This is inconsistent with what people have been finding before. Okay. All right. Let's probe a little bit more. Maybe you want to break down why income fell most for the wealthy. You might want to ask yourself, is it that they had more unemployment? Is it that given employment, they worked fewer hours? Is it that given their hours, they had different wages? The answer turns out to be that the wealthy, the top quartile, I should say, of income, I shouldn't say wealthy, the top quartile actually had the biggest decline because they saw the biggest decline in employment of the other groups and less of a return. And you can see that here, where you see a separation in employment rate by income quartile, with the top quartile being the worst. And then you don't see it as much in hours or in wages. Okay. Now, let me switch for a second and talk a little bit about consumption. Okay. In consumption, you also see a decline that's largest for the top quartiles, whether it's in rural areas or urban areas, and slower return, except that the difference is more muted, meaning the gap between the highest quartile and the lowest quartile is a little bit smaller in terms of the divergence during the pandemic. Now, why is it that the gap between the wealthiest and the least wealthy in terms of the decline is bigger in income than consumption? The answer is that people smooth their consumption. So what do I mean by that? I mean that when your income goes up, your consumption doesn't rise as much as your income. When your income falls, your consumption doesn't fall as much as your income. You use some combination of borrowing and borrowing and lending, or savings, I should say, and borrowing to offset the change in income. Now, if you want to see this, we have a standard analysis in economics. We sometimes call them Cochrane or Townsend regressions, where you regress or you correlate your income on, your consumption on your left-hand side with aggregate and idiosyncratic income on the right-hand side. And the idea is to see how much your personal income affects your consumption versus how much aggregate consumption affects aggregate income affects your consumption. And what you typically find in this context is that there's a lot of smoothing. In India, before the pandemic, what you found is that basically only about 9% of your income change is associated with the consumption change. Okay, that's the marginal propensity to consume. For every dollar or every 100 rupees of additional income, you'll only increase consumption about 9 rupees. Okay, roughly speaking. It's a little bit higher in urban India, less insurance in urban India than it is in rural India, but that's roughly what we find. Now, you might ask yourself, well, did that continue in 2020? And the answer is yeah, largely. While there was a little bit less smoothing of idiosyncratic consumption, idiosyncratic income during the pandemic, it's roughly the same. Basically about 9% marginal propensity to consume. That really smooths out your income changes. You might ask yourself, wait, hold on a second. Are the wealthy more able to smooth their income than the poor? And the answer is no. So here I'm showing you that same regression, except I'm going to focus on either the lowest quartile or the highest quartile based on 2019 income. And you see that the coefficient on smoothing for both pre-pandemic is about the same. And then the change during the pandemic is roughly the same, meaning there's not much change during the pandemic, and the top quartile and lowest quartile seem to have similar ability to smooth income. It explains why that large gap in income decline results in a smaller gap in consumption decline. Still, the top quartile sees the biggest decline in consumption, but it's not as severe, okay, as their relative decline in income. All right, that's one thing to think about consumption. Another thing to think about in consumption is to focus on, a lot of people are worried about food poverty. And so one of the things that we tried to look at is let's not just look at the aggregate money spent on consumption. Let's try to break that down into pieces: food, clothing, fuel, etc. And here what you have is, again, from CPHS, all this is from CPHS, you can break down consumption into those different categories and see how much there was decline. Again, our index is 2019, so we normalize 2019 levels at 100%, and we see the decline. And what's very interesting about this is that you'll see that food, which is this solid black line, declines the least in percentage terms, whereas other things decline dramatically. And you can see this in both these figures, whether it's clothes, power, health, appliances. Sadly, also education expenditures decline during this period, but food is protected. Another way to see this is to calculate the fraction of your consumption that's spent on food versus other things. And here we're going to show food, intoxicants, clothing, and power fuel to illustrate. And what you see here is that basically an illustration of Engel's law, which is that Engel's law is typically stated as when your income increases, the fraction spent on food declines. The flip side of Engel's law is a nice protection against poverty, at least food poverty, is that when income declines, your food share rises. That's in fact exactly what we see. And we don't see a rise during the pandemic right here in the other things. The next closest thing is power and fuel, but if you look at intoxicants or fuel or clothing, you actually see a decline in the share of your budget spent on food, on those two things, sorry, intoxicants and clothing. Food share rises. So again, to summarize, consumption fell less because of smoothing. Moreover, within your consumption budget, people prioritize, especially the poor, prioritize food. If we could, for example, see food or say caloric intake, my guess is what this implies is that the inequality in caloric intake might not have increased during the pandemic. Okay, now you might ask yourself, hey, you all categorize quartiles based upon 2019 income. Let me be more precise. What we did is for every individual, we look at what household they're in 2019, and then we see where in the income distribution that household is. Okay, and that's how we characterize people in top quartiles, bottom quartiles, etc. Up until now. You might say, let's change that around. Let's group people, for example, a different way, say by their occupation. And then they check to see whether they're in a top quartile occupation or a lower quartile occupation, and then categorize their income quartiles that way. So we did that. And you get very similar answers. Top quartile income still fell the most and stayed low. If you look at consumption, similar sorts of issues. So what that means is that you can break things down, that is to say, group people into quartiles in different ways based upon their household consumption, their individual consumption, individual household income, individual income, occupational income, and you're going to get similar answers. Inequality seems to have fallen. Okay. Another very big question is the following. Is this just mean reversion? Is it that, you know, people that are in the highest quartiles in 2019, those are people that recently achieved that, so they have very high income, but, you know, there's mean reversion in the economy, and so all you're seeing is the effect of mean reversion. The high income guys see a bigger decline than the lower income guys see. And the answer to this, I think, is that yes, there is some mean reversion for sure, but it doesn't explain what we find completely. There is still a bigger decline in income and consumption amongst the highest quartiles. So how do we do that? We look at two groups of people. People that are just recently arriving in 2019 in the top quartile versus ones that were in the top quartile from 2015 to 2019. So I call this the persistent top quartiles. And so if you look at the dashed lines, you certainly see that you have the same pattern. In fact, the people that most recently arrived in the top quartiles are the ones that are the quickest to leave it during the pandemic. But it's also the case that people that were in the top quartile during this entire period actually see the biggest declines relative to people that were in the bottom quartile this entire period. And you can see that in the solid lines here. So if you compare the solid black line to the solid red line, those are the persistent bottom quartile and top quartile folks. Okay, and you see that gap, the inequality actually declined, and also true in rural India as well as urban India. Same pattern if you look at consumption. Again, the solid lines have the same pattern. Solid lines are the persistently top quartile. persistently lowest quartile. Here's another question. What happened in this pandemic relative to demonetization? One of the nice things about CPHS is that you can actually look at a very long time series and compare the two. And what you really find, interestingly, is that COVID reduced inequality, demonetization did not, and we can compare the two. So here's the longer run. Usually I've been showing you 2019 through 2020 data. Now I'm going to show you 2015 through 2020 data. And here we're benchmarking, again, indexing everybody based upon average 2019 income. I'm going to set that equal to 100. And what you see is before the pandemic, higher income individuals saw big increases. Households that were in the bottom quartile saw slower increases, but they did still see increases during this period. The reason it comes down here, by the way, is just so that we can normalize. So that's an artifact of the way that we construct the data. Here you see what happened in the pandemic. Here you see what happened in demonetization. Demonetization is marked. Remember, this is November 2016. We go out about 6 months just to see the impact. So look between these two dashed lines, vertical dashed lines, to see demonetization. And then here you're going to see, the first cases, lockdown, end of lockdown for the pandemic. Okay. And what do we see? We saw during demonetization, there was no real change in inequality. That's totally different than what you see during lockdown. There was a massive decline in inequality during the lockdown, and even post the lockdown for urban India. And you see something similar in rural India as well. We're going to talk a little bit about how more fluctuating or how much more variable rural India is in just a little bit. But it seems that COVID was more progressive than demonetization was. Not to say that we should have another COVID to get progressivity. I'm just saying that there was a decline in inequality during COVID. And if you look at consumption, again, more muted effects, but similar. COVID is more progressive. This you've already seen, this portion. All I want to show you is that in demonetization, we didn't see the same thing. Okay. Now, here's the wrench. Let's look at the Gini coefficient. Okay. Now, if you guys remember, the Gini coefficient is the following. You put on the x-axis the cumulative share of the population. Okay, and on the y-axis, you put the cumulative share of income that they represent, okay, with the highest income on the right and the lowest income on the left. Ideally, if you have real income equality, what you should say is, as you increase the fraction of the population, you're going to increase the fraction of the income they account for, so that 50% of the population accounts for 50% of the income. That's what this best case scenario is for equality. It's this dashed line. Reality is a little different. Lower income individuals account for a lower share of income, and higher income individuals account for a higher share of income. And so typically you'll see a bowed shape like this. It's called a Lorentz curve. And we look at the area between these two to figure out what your inequality, we look at that area between this dashed line and one of these colored curves, the Lorentz curves. We calculate that amount, and the larger is that gap, the more inequality there is. And that's your Gini coefficient. Okay, larger Gini coefficient, worse. Here, what we've done is we've plotted what happened during the pandemic to the Lorentz curves, just to introduce you to the Gini curve. So you've got January 2020, pre-pandemic, lockdown, and then July post-lockdown. And what you see is you see inequality at the baseline, that's the blue line, and then you see a jump during the lockdown to a lower level or higher level of inequality, it seems, according to the Gini coefficient, and then a jump back up a little bit after the pandemic, but not to the same level of inequality as you had before. So a little bit more inequality, it seems. And that's true in urban and rural India. Remember, this is the opposite message I've been giving you so far. Now you can plot this instead as a Gini coefficient. So plot those areas. Higher is, again, more inequality, and you'll find something very consistent. So here you've got urban India and rural India going back to 2015. You see higher inequality in rural India than urban India, but fairly stable over time. But during the pandemic, it actually seems that the Gini coefficient jumped. So this says that inequality rose during the pandemic, even more so in rural areas than, to a higher level in rural areas, but not necessarily in a relative sense, more in rural areas than the urban areas, and then fell afterwards back to the kind of pre-pandemic baseline. It's a bit of a puzzle. Now, the puzzle is not extreme. In consumption, you don't see any change. So you can do that income, that same sort of Gini coefficient, you could calculate it for consumption, and you wouldn't see a big jump up like you see for the income Gini in the consumption Gini. Okay, so this is an income Gini question. Well, the question is, how do you reconcile these two findings? Why do we get different results for income and consumption on the one hand and Gini on the other hand? And I think the answer lies in what you're calculating. What do we do in our first two sets of results, the income and consumption over time? We're following individual households, and we're finding that inequality fell. And this is possible, by the way, because CPHS is a panel data set. You're following the same households over time. Typically, when we calculate Ginis, we're not usually doing that. We're just doing cross sections. So the way to think about it is that what Gini follows is not individual households, but percentiles. We're saying what is happening to the percentiles, the 25th percentile, 75th percentile, et cetera, over time. Is their income levels rising or falling? And what percentiles show, again, those are not individuals, those are actual percentile cutoffs, those are showing that inequality increased. And we can show you that the answers are different by tracking the quartiles explicitly over time versus tracking the households. If we track the quartiles over time, that is to say each period, each month of CPHS, we calculate what the 25th percentile is, what the 75th percentile is, and the other quartiles in between, and we see what those happens to those cutoffs over time. We see the cutoffs for the 25th percentile, the low end, actually falls more than the 75th percentile. That is to say, the lowest quartile, their cutoff falls the most relative to the top quartile. Okay, you see that in urban India. Now this is inverted. It's the first quartile that's the biggest decline. And if you look at rural India, same sort of issue. Okay, so if you look tracking percentiles, you do see a decrease in inequality. But the problem is that's not the right measure. What we care about is not the statistical cutoffs. What we should care about is individual households. That is to say, the individual household will both track what the change in the cutoff is, plus the movement across the quartiles. Okay, and when you do that, you get our graph, which is that inequality actually declined during the pandemic. And so that's an important thing. I would somewhat humbly suggest that in fact, if you have longitudinal data, that's a better measure of inequality than just tracking percentiles and repeated cross sections. It's a better measure and sometimes can give you different answers, and it does in COVID. Okay, as I wrap up, I want to talk a little bit about mechanisms and the implications for inequality dynamics in India. So here's one explanation we think we found some evidence for. And that the idea is very simple. You can divide people's income into capital income and labor income. And capital income tends to be, income from owning a business. It's the profits that you make, whereas labor income is the wages, and they tend to be a little bit more stable. Capital income is more volatile than labor income is. Okay. And what I think is happening for a lot of this, although not all of this, is that higher income individuals, higher quartile individuals, are actually exposed more to capital income and the variability of that income than they are to labor income. This is not a new idea. In the US, we've seen this for some time. Folks like Govanan et al. Have shown that higher quartiles tend to have income that follows the business cycle, or is more correlated with the business cycle than lower income individuals do. So there's greater variability in quartiles. We're going to show that that's also the case in India, and starkly so in rural India. So here's urban India, rural India. We're now showing seasonal flux. We're showing monthly income per capita for these different quartiles, again, for a longer series. And one of the interesting things that we're going to show you here is that in rural India, you see that the top quartile, but not the bottom quartile, has this massive fluctuation every season. And the reason is they're the farm owners, not the farm laborers. Farm laborers earn less, but they have stable income. Farm owners, especially big farm owners, have a lot of fluctuating income. And it's this sort of idea that we have. Now, we see it less in urban India, but I'm going to show you it's there too through regression analysis. But basically, there's a lot more fluctuating of incomes in the higher quartiles. And that's going to be a big issue, because what is lockdown? It's a massive reduction in capital income or aggregate income. You're going to see this in consumption too. In fact, if you look at consumption, you see even in urban India, you see more fluctuation in the top quartiles versus the bottom quartiles. Now, here's a way to get at this statistically. What you can do is you can run a regression where on the left-hand side, you put individual income, and on the right-hand side, you put aggregate income, okay? And when you run that regression, you can run that separately for different quartiles, or interact the right-hand side with quartiles or terciles of income and see what happens. And what you're interested in finding out is the coefficient on aggregate income. The higher the coefficient on aggregate income, the more sensitive individual income is to aggregate income. That is to say, more subject to that variability that you see in the aggregate income. Now, you can do that and figure out what that variability, that correlation is for the lowest quartiles versus the highest. And what you find is whether you look at all of India, urban India, or rural India, the highest quartiles have a higher beta than rural India. Now, why do I use the word beta? That comes from finance. So if you do asset pricing, you'll very often try to see is the, what is the rate of return on a stock, excess return on a stock? What is it specific to the stock, and how much is it correlated with the market? That's the alpha and the beta. The beta is the correlation with the market. Roughly what we're saying here is the top quartile income has a high beta. It's very much correlated with the market or the overall economy. Okay, and that might be why they experience this. Now, this is research in progress. So I'm going to tell you about two other mechanisms that we're going to explore, three really. One is we're going to look at demand, and we're going to say, okay, now if instead of focusing on capital income, we focus on labor income, let's focus on the demand side. Is it possible that the top quartiles work in occupations that saw the biggest decline in demand during the lockdown? That's a demand side story that we'll explore. There's also a supply side story. Maybe the folks that are in the top quartile experienced an increase in the reservation rates, that is to say the amount of money that would have to be offered to them in order for them to actually take a job as opposed to stay at home and be unemployed. Maybe the reservation wages increased during the pandemic because the top quartiles were more worried about COVID. So we're gonna explore that, but we haven't got results yet. Then the last thing we want to do is say, why is it that we find different results in, say, the United States and in India? In India, we find that the top quartiles see the biggest decline in income. In the United States, we don't see that. And one of the explanations in the United States is top quartiles were able to engage in remote work using the internet. And so that they could protect their income. They could both have their protection from COVID and eat their cake, so to speak, via high income. And maybe that's not true in India. Maybe remote work really isn't an option for the top quartiles in income. And so they were actually exposed more to COVID than the top quartiles in the US. Okay. Another really interesting thing that we're exploring, this is with Sabarish Ramachandran, when we calculate deaths from COVID, the excess deaths during the pandemic, which is not the same thing as COVID deaths, using the rosters in CPHS, which track whether or not a person has died. It's separate research that we've talked about recently. We've massively undercounted deaths in India if we use excess deaths as a measure, but we also check to see if excess deaths were correlated with income. And one of the things that we found is that before COVID, as it turns out, the death rate was highly regressive. What I mean by that is that the highest tercile of income had lower death rates than the lowest tercile. Lowest tercile had higher death rates. But during the pandemic, that reversed so that all the groups roughly had the same death rate. And so in the pandemic, we saw the biggest increases in death rate for the highest terciles, not for the lowest terciles. In fact, if you sum up these pandemic level tercile effects with the pre-pandemic, you get roughly even death rates across the quartiles, across the terciles during the pandemic. So that's another thing I think we're going to be exploring. All right, let me just end on this slide. What this analysis makes me do is think a little bit about the dynamics of inequality in India. One interesting question is, why do we get disparate results in India in the United States? In the US, you see a lot more regressive effects of the pandemic. In India, you see progressive effects of the pandemic. What happened? For those of you that study economic development, you might remember the Kuznets curve. The Kuznets curve says that as income per capita in a country rises, first inequality rises and then falls. Maybe the US and India are different places. Remember, COVID is a move leftward on the x-axis. It's lower income per capita. In the US, maybe that caused an increase in inequality, and maybe in India, it caused a decrease in inequality because India is on this part of the curve and the US is on this part of the curve. I think a really interesting question to explore further or think about is this higher beta due to that the higher incomes have higher beta because of their capital income. And then so when you have a shock to aggregate income, especially to profits in the economy, the rich are going to feel it more. I think that's very interesting in two respects. One is it tells you that the level of inequality in the economy might be lower than just the means. You should look at the variances. The second thing it does, it suggests that higher beta might contribute to increased inequality over time, because the fact that you have greater availability probably means also that you're going to have higher growth rates. And so it could be that those two things go hand in hand. Last thing I'll end with is we should be careful in our use of the Gini. It could be that it's masking real trends and inequality at the individual or household level. Let me stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Malani. That was a very, very interesting, very well researched, very detailed presentation. And I want to thank you for sharing it, sharing it with our audience here. Let me call upon our chair, Dr. Patnaik, to pick up on some of the conclusions that you've arrived upon, and to also ask her to share her thoughts and have a brief discussion with you on this. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Patnaik.
Thank you, Shilpa. So thanks, Anup, for a very clear and very interesting presentation. And, we all want to look at CPHS data, but it takes a lot of hard work to do that. So thank you so much for actually doing it in this short time and sharing your results with us. So let me just first, for the sake of the audience who perhaps it was a little technical for some of the audience, as Shilpa pointed out to me, very briefly summarize a couple of your main conclusions. First, that poverty certainly increased. We saw a decline in both income and consumption. The decline in income was the same for maybe both the top percentile and the bottom percentile, but that the bottom, because they do more consumption smoothing, perhaps because they just have to survive, so their consumption did not fall as much, so their marginal propensity to consume was such that they perhaps borrowed or they dissaved and they tried to smooth their consumption, while the top percentile consumption dropped more. So that seemed to be what I understood from the discussion on your results from poverty. Am I right?
So for poverty, both income and consumption fell.
Yeah.
The poverty stuff basically says, I'm just going to look at the bottom folks.
Yeah.
People at the bottom saw a decline in income. And so if you measure poverty as an objective line, if you fall below it, you're poor. The share of the population that was poor rose. So that's the main result. But in terms of income and consumption, I think on the income side, I would say something like the following. Income fell as a percentage of 2019 income. Income fell more for the top quartiles and the bottom quartiles. And I think that, and recovered the least after lockdown. And there, I think I would make the argument that you did, which is the poor didn't have a choice to stay at home and avoid COVID. They had to go back because they need to meet needs. And so they went back to work much more quickly. Then on the consumption side, both groups saved at about that is to say, they protected their consumption at about the same rate. Their marginal propensity to consume is very similar, which means that even though the gap in income, that is to say, the highest income folks had the biggest drop in income, the lowest income folks had the smallest drop in income, that when you translate that to consumption, it's a little bit more contracted. It's still progressive in terms of the change in consumption, but just not as extreme in terms of the gap.
Yeah.
Again, that's just because both groups were smoothing their consumption equally.
So, and one way of thinking about why this might have happened is, what you call the reserve wage, or what one may call wage flexibility, that at the lower end for the kind of informal sector wages, at the lower end, people are more unskilled and more employed in informal sector jobs, and there's a lot of wage flexibility. A lot of the times it's also that they are self-employed. So when their income is falling, it's more like, okay, I was selling fruit, and instead of 20 people coming to buy fruit, 3 people came to buy fruit. And that led to a decline in income. Whereas for the top end, it could be more of, okay, if you can't hire me, I get thrown out of my job because the company that hires me can no longer afford to hire me, and the job I get as a Uber driver, my reserve wage is such that I don't go down to that level of I don't accept that level of income. So the kind of differences that we see in the context of the declines in incomes of the very poor versus the top, I think they are very, very interesting. And that's something to study both in terms of the occupation, which would be interesting to go into detail, whether it was the sort of self-employed service sector, informal sector, which really saw a lot of wage flexibility. So it saw employment, but at lower wages, whereas at the top, you perhaps did not see that kind of wage flexibility. So that could perhaps be, that's something to think about and explore. On the capital income, the data seems to suggest that we've seen we've seen a boom in the stock market. So money has in fact moved financial savings of households, and obviously the households that do financial savings are not the ones at the bottom, but your top quartile perhaps. And we've seen financial savings move from bank deposits. So they have increased. First, financial savings have increased. Second, they have moved from bank deposits to mutual funds, so to the stock market, where returns have been very, very high. And I mean, people are raising questions about why there is such a boom in the stock market. So in fact, capital income may not have been income so far, because a lot of it is capital gains that people see rather than a dividend payout. So it may not have shown up in income, but it shows up perhaps in assets, and these asset prices have increased. So it could possibly be, and that's something to look at, that it could possibly be that actually, because of the change in asset prices, because of the increase in asset prices, you did not see that much of a decline if inequality is measured not merely by income and consumption, but also by holding of assets. So the richer households, who would have been the ones whose financial savings have increased, whose perhaps they haven't spent the money that they earned, could perhaps have seen increases in their asset prices. So is that something that is worth considering? I'm not sure that all questions can be answered by the CPHS data, but what do you think of that?
So I want to, so first of all, I want to definitely agree with your last statement. CPHS is one slice of the data. It's important that it be reconciled with macro data as well. And everybody should remember that. I'm showing you CPHS numbers. This is a first statement of results. We should look to see if we see it in other data sets as well. We may not, and we want to figure out if it's still true afterwards. I have a reasonable amount of faith in CPHS. It is a remarkable data set. Even if you look across countries, including the US, we don't have a lot of data sets that are as complete as this. So I like it, but I understand it's not complete. Now, I want to make two caveats to your capital income comment. When I think of capital income, I don't think of just capital income from stock markets and things like that. I actually think if you're the owner of a small company, and which many people are, you are getting capital income when we look at the profits that you earn. And so that's what I mean by capital income. Think of it as business income. And that's in a wide array of the economy. Even low income individuals will, if they have a little food stall, are making profits to some extent, right? But it so happens that once you separate out labor income and capital income, you'll see that the aggregate change in the economy tends to manifest or cash out in capital income, meaning the variability shows up more in this broader definition of capital income, very economic definition of capital income as opposed to finance definition. And there, I think, is where you're going to see a lot of this. That's the mechanism for the fluctuations that we're seeing. That is to say, when we say individual income is correlated with aggregate income, I think it's through that broader definition of capital income. So that's the first thing. The second thing I want to point out is it is true that the stock market has gone up. Lots of places that's true. It's a good question as to why. And it is true that higher incomes have more exposure to the stock market. But I also want to point out that a lot of the savings of the higher income is not in the stock market. Even in the United States, there's a lot of a lot of your wealth is not in capital income in the stock market sense, even in the US, and even less so, I think, in India. A lot of the other exposures, things like real estate, but also business ownership and things like this. So that's an important one. And we find one interesting feature that we're exploring, and then we'll do in a different paper about this. And that is that when we look at different states, we see the states that have greater savings, cutback of consumption by the wealthy, also tend to have greater borrowing by the poor, suggesting that sometimes what the wealthy do is they save, but they save in local capital markets rather than national capital markets like the stock market, and then that funds borrowing by the local poor who need it during COVID. And so we think that this is an interesting informal stabilizer that might occur. Again, we're still tentative about this. We find some indirect evidence. We're looking for more direct evidence, but it would suggest that beyond the stock market, there's another big capital market that matters that also indirectly serves as a buffer for the poor. Might again have made, at least in the context of a supply shock, COVID be less regressive than we anticipated and potentially progressive.
Okay, thanks, Anup. I would like to open up for questions, but before that, if I may invite Dr. Kelkar for his comments. Dr. Kelkar.
Yeah. First, I want to thank Professor Malani. It's a very, very sort of data-driven presentation on very important issues, and I think it's going to take some time to absorb all the things which he has said, because it is a important data later. I wanted two comments. First comment is about he was comparing India's fiscal stance versus other countries. You know, Professor, I think somehow I believe the Indian fiscal stance understates the actually what was done. For instance, very large amount of support came from destocking government stocks of food grains and other foodstuff, which will not be captured in your fiscal, but the current year's fiscal expenditure. So there is an understatement of India's fiscal support, where a massive support was given for consumption stabilization of food grains, of edible oil, of various other essential, and that somehow doesn't get in our sort of data set so far. So maybe there is some understatement of government support, and also in the lot of support went from the state governments, which is also doesn't get reflected in the central government deficits. So I think we have to perhaps look a little more carefully, and Indian fiscal support may not be as low as what we find in central government deficits. The second point is really what I want to take it further. What Ila said, I was going to say that maybe we are using a not correct metric for inequality, because this was a very unusual shock. It had made a lot of changes in the balance sheets of the different households, and as a net sort of debt position of the lower households increased much more sharply compared to the richer households. So if you take the net wealth of as a one marker for looking at inequalities, maybe it's not, we'll find the same consistent impact, that it was not equitable in quotation mark. It also has continued and probably intensified inequities if you take the net effect of the balance sheet. So that's the second point I'm going to make. And the third point is I'm grateful for you are also pointing out the importance of data, because somehow sometimes it's missed, and really you use of course what is data available to use it very, very intensively. But I want once again want to thank you for the absolute outstanding presentation on two critical issues: inequality and poverty.
Thank you, Dr. Kelkar. Professor Malani.
Yeah, I'll just make two quick comments because
Yes,
I know
please.
we're running over.
No, that's fine.
First of all, thank you, Dr. Kirko. Those are great comments. On the first one, I completely agree. When we look at actual fiscal stimulus, so income from the government, which is recorded in CPHS, we find very, very modest levels of fiscal support. But it's correct that there's indirect fiscal support if you destock, for example, food grains, and that reduces the effective price of food, especially for the poor. You're not picking that up at all in CPHS, and so that's an important thing to remember. Now, I'm not sure what the magnitude of that was, and that's worth calculating to see how much, in fact, as a percentage of overall food consumption, the destocking was, and how much that's likely to change the relative prices. So that's something that we should continue looking at. Second, on the debt position, I agree that the debt position of households at the lowest quartiles did get worse. The question is whether we should think of that as a positive or a negative. On the one hand, it is a portion of consumption smoothing. So I actually think it's good that they can take on debt. And you're right, it's bad for their fiscal balance sheet, but it's good for their consumption, which is what we also ultimately care about, especially during a period when income fell. But the way that I look at this is that, yeah, of course, balance sheets are going to change over time. Let's then look at overall income over the lifetime, not in a permanent income sense, but just in an aggregate sense for these households, and see what happened. And they're the most critical issue, which makes me think that, again, we probably saw a reduction in inequality, is that the incomes fell the most for the highest quartile in percentage terms, not in levels, in percentage terms. And so what that means is, yes, debt position increased, but if you look at overall the life cycle, when they have to repay those debts, the poor still inched a little bit closer to the wealthy in percentage terms. Again, I wouldn't endorse COVID. I just want to be very clear. COVID was a terrible thing. Lots of people died, poverty increased. But if we look at inequality, that went in the opposite direction. To me, that tells me that inequality is not always the right outcome to look at, that poverty is a better thing to study. But again, that's my personal takeaway.
I have just one quick follow-up question on the fiscal stimulus and its impact, because you're looking at households and it gives you employment and occupation. Does it allow us to look at to the extent to which Manrega helped sustain incomes, or what the impact of Manrega was? Because these households, we did see a very large increase in demand for Manrega during COVID. So does it help us do that? Because that would be an interesting take on what the impact of the fiscal stimulus was, even where we can't look at food, but we could look at Manrega.
If Manrega is recorded as income from government in CPHS, the answer is yes. The data can tell us the answer to that question. If households do not report it as government income, then it just gets absorbed into a broader income category, and we can't specifically tease out the Manrega effect. We could do some more complicated stuff, like seeing places where we see more Manrega draws, are we seeing greater increases in income or less of a reduction in income for CPHS. That introduces a lot of noise to the analysis, but it's something that we can do. But what I would do is I would just check with CPHS, and so now I'll write it down, and I will check with them to see what their, when they explain the survey to households, do they tell households report Manrega as government income?
Thank you. Any further questions, Dr. Patnaik? Dr. Kekar, any final words, comments?
No, Bob. I mean, the only comment I want to make, that I completely agree with him, that at least in India, I also agree that poverty is far more important issue and at this stage of development. So there I'm totally with him. But again, I want to thank him.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Malani. Thank you, Dr. Patnaik, for such a relevant discussion. We've had so many learnings and takeaway, and I really want to thank you, our distinguished guests, for engaging with us. You've given us many important insights, many learnings on a sensitive and critically important subject. So thank you once again. Dr. Kekar, many thanks for your valuable inputs and your support. To my PIC colleagues, this event is the result of your hard work and efforts behind the scenes. Thank you very much. And last but certainly not the least, many thanks to our audience for joining in on what is a long weekend for many here in India. Thank you for your participation and your presence. Please do join our forthcoming event on the 18th of August, which is a discussion on the book, The Long Game, How the Chinese Negotiate with India, by former Ambassador Vijay Gokhale. Do stay tuned for further updates on PIC's social media pages. Professor Malani, Professor Patnaik, we look forward to hosting you again in the near future. Thank you. This concludes today's event on income inequality in India. Shubharatri, good evening, and a very good day to those in the US.